Hello, this video replaces the in-class work for week 3 in Comp 2. In this video, I'll discuss a few readings that I wanted to look at, as well as some assignments that are going to be due after the in-class work this week. So first, I wanted to look at page 128 of Everything's an Argument. This is in the yellow section at the end of the rhetorical analysis chapter. I did not assign these pages, but did want to point out that each chapter has this yellow section at the end, and there are guides to writing whichever kind of paper that chapter is about. And it's more about process, and that's something you guys learn in Comp 1, so that's why I don't assign them. But again, wanted to point them out so that if you do get stuck somewhere in the process, that section can help you. But this part is called Thinking About Organization. It's from the Rhetorical Analysis chapter, and it's not so much about organization as about the pieces that you're going to want to have in your paper. And a lot of these things you guys will be taking from your planning page, your plan page that you did last week. So context about the author, and you know where it was published, of course. And then evidence that you've read the argument carefully and critically is super important. So you might not be an expert on whatever topic that article's about, for example, voting or privacy, but you can show that you're an expert on the article itself because you read it so thoroughly. So to do that, that comes down to down here, you're going to use evidence from the source to back up your points about it. Sometimes you might need to add in other context for your reader. This comes back to the kinds of ways we might use evidence in our paper. So, for example, if I were to write my paper about that video we watched last week, the ESPYs Awards, I might want to give extra context on athletes who have been activists to help my reader understand why this argument is so important. Of course, a synopsis or a summary of your article. And then a lot of it is going to be about your judgment, your claim about how effective that argument is. So, you know, that's our main point. That's our actual thesis. And going back to that example of the ESPYs, I talked about how I could maybe say this was an effective argument because the authors use a serious tone, their ethos as athletes, and logos in the terms of facts about specific examples of police brutality. So again, the analysis and the evidence is really the bulk of your paper in terms of these are the pieces that you're going to be analyzing and then judging the effectiveness based on. So back over here on Blackboard in the in-class materials folder, there's the page number there that I just looked at. And then the other pages I want to look at are an easy writer. So the section on quotation marks, brackets, ellipses, and italics. So I encourage you to go through those and just mark them for reference because I know you guys aren't going to be able to memorize all these rules, but you should be able to find, you know, the rules for using them as you're writing your papers. And I did want to go over a few specifics. And of course, this is the second part of a sequence in using sources that started with the integrating that you guys should have watched before watching this video. And then the part 3 is going to be the MLA that you're going to work on after this in-class work. So starting with quotation marks, there are specific circumstances that we do want to use them. And most of us know that's specifically or primarily when we're quoting someone else or using someone else's words. And that lets our reader know those are not my words. My words are Smith proposes. Smith's words are let's grab a burger. However, sometimes we might quote someone who's quoting someone else. So in this example, I'm quoting Caesar, but Caesar is quoting Smith, okay, who said let's grab a burger. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and change the let's grab a burger quote to single because that's what Caesar's quoting. And then leave my double quotes around what Caesar said so that my reader knows I'm quoting Caesar. And it's easier to read than if we had left these as double. And the final way we're going to generally use quotation marks is the titles of shorter works. And I say usually, so it's generally works that are smaller parts of larger works. So a chapter in a book would have its title in quotation marks, or a newspaper article that's part of a newspaper, the newspaper article would be in quotation marks, okay? or like say a poem that's part of a book, the title of the poem itself would be in quotation marks. So there are a few circumstances when we're quoting where we won't use quotation marks. And the main one is when we use long quotations. And by long, that means more than 4 lines of your paper. So if you do have a longer quote, go ahead and type it out before deciding if it meets this criteria. And we don't really use that long of quotes very often. So this is going to be a pretty rare circumstance. So if you do, you're going to block it off. There's an example at the bottom of page 333 of Easy Writer. And as you can see, it's blocked off. It's sort of made into a little square. And that lets our reader know that's a quote instead of using the quotation marks. If there is a quote within that block quote, you'll go ahead and leave those as double. Because again, it's about clarity. Punctuation is all about letting our reader know how to read what we're writing. Of course, another time we won't use quotation marks that might come across is if we are paraphrasing, right? So I'm still using their ideas, you know, here example with Smith, but because I'm putting it in my own words, of course, I'm not going to use quotation marks because then that would make the reader think that's exactly what he said. And then another circumstance I see sometimes in student papers doesn't necessarily have to do with using sources, but it's the idea of using quotation marks for emphasis, and that's not really something that we do in formal writing. So I just wanted to point that out. If you're wanting to add emphasis, you would have to do that another way. All right, so where does this punctuation go? Almost all the time, quotation marks go outside of our punctuation. All right, so periods, commas, dashes, question marks, and exclamation points. And as you can see here, by keeping it inside, that eliminates confusion, because if I had the question mark out here, it would be confusing to my reader. Again, that's what punctuation does. There is one exception to this rule. And let me get to that first. So if I do have a parenthetical reference or in-text citation, which is part of MLA, the period will go outside over here. And the way I try to remember that is Smith too is part of this sentence. It goes along with the quote. So I want to make sure the reader knows that's all one package. It all belongs in the same sentence. Okay. So in those circumstances, the quotation marks are inside, as well as when we use colons and semicolons, which are pretty rare punctuation to use, but because they sort of separate sentences, I think that kind of makes sense too, to keep them on the inside. And I do have, let me pause this here, some examples to look at. So back over here in the in-class materials folder is a quotation marks and ellipses worksheet. And the top half has us figure out which of these sentences need quotation marks. So I'd like you to take a look at that and try to figure out which parts of the sentences need quotation marks. And then it should follow one of those rules, right, in terms of why we're using that. And if you have any questions about that, just let me know. It's not something that you need to turn in, but if you are confused, again, just let me know. So in terms of the other punctuations I wanted to look at, the first is brackets, and I talked briefly about brackets in the before class lesson for this week, and we use those. That's the generally accepted way to let our readers know that we've maybe changed the quote in a certain way, and we never want to change it to change the meaning. We only change it for clarity or explanation. So in my example before class, I think I changed a present tense verb to an ing verb because that made sense of the grammar of the sentence. So if we're needing to change something for grammar, we'll put brackets around it. Or in terms of explanatory comments, for example, maybe I'm using a quote that says something about he or him, but I didn't use the part of the quote that had the who he or him is. So I might in brackets say John. So that lets my reader know who he is because I haven't used the part of the quote that if I didn't use that. So that explains what I mean. We can also alter our quotes with ellipses, and that's when we use those when we take words out of a quote. Maybe we don't need to use the whole sentence, or we want to use part of one sentence and part of another. When we do take out words, we still need to make sure that what's left is grammatical. And when we type that out, you're going to type it period, space, period, space, period. If you just do 3 periods, it will auto-format and it looks weird. If you take out the end of a sentence, you'll add a 4th period because that's the 3 ellipses plus the actual period for the end of the sentence. That's explained on pages 340 and 341. And then one more note, if you're just quoting like one word or one or two words, you don't have to put ellipses, word, ellipses, because the reader will understand. Yeah, there's probably more to this quote than one or two words. So the ellipses let our reader know, hey, there's more to the original if they might not know that otherwise. And back on that quotation marks and ellipses worksheet, there are some examples for you to practice. And again, you don't need to turn those in, but it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with these tools because you will be using them in your papers this semester. The final punctuation I wanted to look at is italics, and over on page 347, it gives a list. So as opposed to quotation marks giving or putting those around the titles of shorter works, it's generally italics are used for longer works. So a book title will be in italics, the book chapter will be in quotation marks. A newspaper title will be in italics. A newspaper article will be in quotation marks. So larger, sort of what we call containers when we use MLA, are generally in italics. And again, I don't expect you to memorize what needs what, but do familiarize yourself with the book so that you can access it when you need to. So now I want to look ahead at the after class stuff for this week and week 4. So again, MLA is what you're going to be thinking about after class this week. And I broke up this chapter. So pages 135 through 158 is the section of the MLA chapter that talks about all the different sources. So a newspaper article, a newspaper article found online, a book chapter. So all those things, you don't necessarily have to read through every single one. So that's why I said scan the rest of that chapter. So again, just familiarizing yourself with where everything is so that when you do have to cite a newspaper article, you can figure out how to do that. In terms of our sources, for Essay 1, I wanted to talk about how to figure out what kind of source you have. So there's about 3 kinds of sources in this folder. The first is a website. All right, so for those, I just gave the link. So a work from a website is what you'll do. Some of them are newspaper articles found on the web. So if it's from a newspaper, but it has a link, that means it's a newspaper article found on the web. And then the third kind, I think yes, is this one. So if your article has something like this at the end, that means it's a work found from a database. So for all 3, no matter what kind of source you're using, all the information is there on the document that you'll need to create your works cited entry. There is one, this mandatory voting, I forgot to include the links on the actual document. So if you're using that source, that's the link to the original. And you'll need to use that because or figure out how to do that because you are going to create a works cited page as part of your after class work. Let's take a look at that assignment. So actually you're doing an outline and a works cited page. So here I have guidelines for the outline, all right, in terms of what it should look like. This is a template, so of course adjust it to your needs. You might not have 4 rhetorical strategies that you're going to write about. Coming back to my example I've been using, in paragraph 3, I might write about the ethos of my author, right, in terms of them being athletes, speaking to other athletes. I could have a paragraph on the tone, their serious tone that they use that helps their argument, and then a third paragraph on the facts that they use to establish logos. Okay, so you might have 3 points, you might have 4, you might have 5. It just depends. So again, adjust the template to your use or to your needs. And the second page here has guidelines on constructing your thesis statement. So don't forget to look at that. Once you're done with your outline, I want you to insert a page break and then type up a perfectly formatted works cited page. So it should have at least one source, and that's the article that you're analyzing. The other thing you're going to need to do after class this week is sign up for a Zoom tutorial, and you can sign up right here. This sign-up sheet is viewable until 5 p.m. Wednesday, January 27th, which is probably when you're watching this video. After 5 p.m., it will be editable by students, and all you need to do is to sign up is just type your name in one of the time slots, and you can do that until Sunday the 31st. So that's the night before tutorials start, and we will be in tutorials next week. There are no classes, And I'm gonna pause this video and start a new one because I can only record for 15 minutes. So I'm gonna pick this back up at the week 4 schedule.